enjoying a polar plunge surrounded by icebergs. The water was freezing, urging a quick return to the ship. A dark shape moved under the ice, impossibly fast. Scrambling to climb out, fingers slipping on the icy edge, a powerful jaw clamped down, dragging into the depths. The Arctic waters claimed another victim. Hello everyone, welcome to the channel. Before we begin the Orca attack story, I want to ask for your support by subscribing to the channel. Your subscription is very important to us, so please subscribe, click the like button, and leave a comment telling us which city you're watching from. Now let's move on to the case. Thomas paddled through the calm waters of the Gulf of Alaska, the paddle slicing cleanly through the glassy surface. The sun, still low in the sky, bathed everything in golden hues. The air was cool but crisp, a slight chill that promised the freshness of the coming morning. He could hear nothing but the rhythm of his strokes and the occasional squawk of seabirds overhead, diving for fish in the clear water. He'd been out here countless times before. Alaska was his sanctuary, the endless wilderness offering a solace he couldn't find anywhere else. The solitude was everything he needed. No bustling city, no crowds of people, just him and the wild. Out here, the coastlines, the mountain peaks, and the cold, deep waters held stories he could never put into words, even if he tried. His kayak, an old yet sturdy craft, glided effortlessly, almost like an extension of his own body, carving through the water with each powerful stroke. The cliffs that rose steeply to his left cast long shadows, but it was still early enough that the sun had just started warming everything around him. The quiet of the morning enveloped him like a blanket. This was what he lived for. This was the peace he sought. He wasn't in a hurry to get anywhere, content to float along for as long as the day would allow. Perfect, Thomas muttered to himself, his voice barely a whisper against the vast expanse of water. His eyes scanned the horizon, noting the few fishing boats on the distant edges of the bay, but none were close enough to disturb his isolation. Everything felt right. He was alone, and that was all he needed. The water shimmered as a gentle breeze picked up. The surface, once so smooth, now rippled in slight undulations, enough to break the perfect symmetry of the water. Thomas glanced over his shoulder, but there was nothing unusual, just the empty expanse. Still, something in the back of his mind nudged him, a slight tinge of discomfort. He shook it off. It was probably just the wind, or perhaps a passing current. He'd been out here long enough to know that the waters had a way of changing quickly, without warning. There was no reason to be alarmed. But as he paddled forward, his eyes caught a sudden movement. At first, it was just a flash beneath the water, a dark shape moving with remarkable speed. It disappeared almost as quickly as it had appeared, and for a moment he thought he had imagined it. Thomas stopped paddling and let his kayak drift with the current. He listened carefully, straining to hear anything that might indicate something was off. But the sounds of the morning, birds calling, the distant roar of the ocean against the cliffs, were still there. His pulse quickened slightly, but he dismissed it. "It's just your mind playing tricks on you," he whispered aloud, almost as if trying to convince himself. There was no reason to panic. He began to paddle again, a little slower this time, more deliberate. The motion of the water was soothing, helping to calm his nerves. He looked around again, more out of habit than anything else, scanning the expanse of the bay for anything that might seem unusual. The vastness of the ocean, the endless horizon, it all felt so overwhelmingly quiet. He should have felt at ease, but the momentary glimpse of something moving under the water was still stuck in his mind. The sky, still streaked with the soft, orange glow of dawn, began to brighten, and the shadows of the cliffs receded. For a few moments, the beauty of the landscape drowned out the nagging feeling in the back of his mind. The serenity of it all almost made him forget that he was alone, that there was nothing but the endless ocean around him. But then it came again. A splash. A violent, sudden disturbance in the water just behind him. He whipped his head around, the blood rushing to his ears. The water churned violently, a dark shadow moving beneath the surface. What the hell? Thomas's voice was barely a breath as his body went rigid. His hand froze on the paddle, but he didn't dare turn his kayak around completely, not knowing what he might find. The hairs on the back of his neck stood on end, and every instinct in his body screamed for him to act, but his body refused to move. The shape was gone again, but this time, there was no mistaking it. It was big. Much bigger than any fish or seal he had ever encountered. It moved, with a strength and purpose he couldn't comprehend. His heart hammered in his chest. He should have turned back. He should have never come out this far. Another splash, closer this time. Thomas's eyes darted over his shoulder, but there was nothing to see. He swallowed hard, trying to push down the panic threatening to rise in his throat. He didn't know what was out there, but he knew enough to recognize when something was wrong. "Stay calm," he whispered, trying to steady his breathing. It's just curious." The water settled again, but this time, the unease in Thomas's gut didn't go away. His mind raced. Orcas. There had been rumors of them in these waters, wild, unpredictable, and intelligent. He knew that orcas, though majestic, were also capable of violent behavior. The thought of one of them surfacing near him made his stomach turn. He had heard stories from locals, but he had always dismissed them as exaggerated. Yet, here he was, alone, on the water, and the splashing noises were becoming harder to ignore. His palms were sweating as he gripped the paddle. He couldn't see them, but he could feel them. The orcas had a way of blending with the water, moving silently, effortlessly. Another disturbance in the water. This time, closer than ever. Thomas froze. He could feel the tension in the air, the way the water seemed to pulse with a life of its own, and he knew he wasn't alone anymore. His breath hitched in his chest. "Okay, just stay calm," he muttered under his breath. He tried to paddle forward, but his movements were stiff, hesitant. The water around him began to churn again, and this time the massive dorsal fin of an orca broke the surface, slicing through the water with terrifying speed. His eyes widened. It was closer than he ever expected, right next to his kayak. It was enormous, sleek, and utterly terrifying. The orca dove back under the water, but it was only for a moment. Thomas's heart raced, and in the stillness that followed, he could feel the weight of the ocean pressing against him. He gripped the paddle tightly, his knuckles white, and his mind spun. There was no question now, he had been spotted. And now, he was prey. His eyes scanned the water around him, searching for any sign of movement. The orca hadn't struck yet, but Thomas could sense the shift in the water, the predator circling. He tried to paddle faster, but the kayak felt too sluggish, too vulnerable, in the vastness of the open ocean. The splash came again, and this time Thomas didn't need to look. The power of the strike was enough to send his kayak spinning out of control. Water splashed over the sides, and the hull cracked beneath the impact. He yelled out, panicked, but it was too late. The kayak flipped violently, sending him tumbling into the frigid water. He surfaced quickly, gasping for air, his mind reeling. The orca had struck with terrifying precision. The kayak was gone, lost to the depths. Panic surged through him, but he forced himself to remain calm. His survival instincts kicked in. He kicked hard, trying to put distance between himself and the water where the orca had struck. But there was no place to hide, only the cold, open water stretching endlessly before him. And then he saw them. More orcas. Dozens of them. Their sleek black and white bodies slicing through the water with terrifying speed. The pod had encircled him. He was trapped. A voice screamed in his head, "Get to the shore, now," but it felt like a hopeless thought. The shore was too far away. The orcas were faster, smarter. He could feel the water moving around him as the orcas swam beneath, their dark eyes watching him. The fear hit him hard, and for the first time, he truly understood what it meant to be prey. Thomas's breath came in shallow gasps as he treaded water, his arms and legs numb from the cold. His heart was racing, each thudding pulse echoing in his chest. He barely heard the distant sound of his kayak drifting away, lost in the expanse of the water. He was alone now, completely alone. The orcas had made their presence known, and now they surrounded him. The pod's massive shadows moved under the surface, their sleek black bodies cutting through the water like ghosts. Thomas couldn't see them all at once, but he could feel them. He could feel their presence in every wave, every movement of the water. His instincts screamed at him to get away, but there was nowhere to go. The shore was too far, the water too vast. He had nowhere to hide. One of the orcas breached the surface, its dorsal fin slicing through the water with terrifying speed. It was enormous, easily twice the size of any creature Thomas had ever encountered. Its eyes, dark and piercing, locked onto him as if assessing his every move. Thomas's throat tightened and his muscles stiffened. The terror coursed through him like a wave, but he fought to remain still, fighting the urge to scream or thrash about. "Stay calm. Stay calm," he muttered under his breath. But the words felt hollow, like a mantra with no power. He couldn't control the panic rising in his chest. The orca's gaze seemed to bore into him, cold and calculating. For a brief, agonizing moment, they were locked in a silent exchange. Predator and prey, the hunter sizing up its victim. Then, without warning, the orca dove back into the depths, disappearing with a grace that made Thomas's heart race even faster. The water around him remained still for a moment, and in the unnatural quiet his mind raced. What the hell do I do? What do I do now? He scanned the water, desperate for any sign of movement. The only sound was the distant rush of waves against the shore, the soft splashing of the water as his body tensed and shifted with the current. His eyes flicked around the horizon, but there was nothing. No other boats, no signs of life, just the vast emptiness of the open water stretching out in every direction. The chill of the water was becoming unbearable, his limbs stiffening from the cold. He tried to swim, but each movement felt sluggish, weighed down by the water. He couldn't seem to move fast enough. Panic twisted in his stomach as he realized just how exposed he was. The orcas were circling and he had nowhere to go. They could strike at any moment. Suddenly, another orca breached the water, this one closer. Thomas's heart skipped a beat, and his breath caught in his throat. It was even bigger than the first, its massive body slicing through the surface with terrifying ease. The orca's dark eye locked onto him, and in that moment, Thomas felt a deep, primal fear grip him. This wasn't curiosity anymore. It was something more. Something that felt like hunger. "Please, God," Thomas whispered, the words trembling in his throat. He wasn't sure if he was praying for help or trying to convince himself that he wasn't going to die here, alone in the water, surrounded by these creatures. The orca surfaced again, this time so close that Thomas could see the intricate details of its black and white markings. The water around it churned with the power of its movements. He could hear the sound of its breath, deep, resonant, and unsettling. The creature's huge body glided through the water with purpose, and Thomas instinctively began to swim away, each stroke more desperate than the last. But the orca followed, moving with an unnatural grace, gliding silently just beneath the surface. Every time Thomas thought he had gained a little distance, the orca closed the gap, coming even closer. The realization hit him like a freight train. He wasn't escaping. Another orca surfaced beside the first, its dorsal fin breaking the surface, and then another, until the entire pod was surrounding him. They moved in perfect synchrony, their bodies undulating through the water like a well-coordinated strike force. Thomas's mind screamed at him to do something, anything to escape, but all he could do was swim and pray that he wouldn't be caught. He didn't know how many orcas were circling him now, but he could feel their presence in every wave, every shift in the water. The pod moved together, their bodies cutting through the surface like a shadow passing over the moon. They were so much faster than he was, so much stronger. A sudden violent splash sent a wave crashing over Thomas, throwing him off balance. He flailed, struggling to stay above the surface, and then he felt it. Something massive, solid, and smooth, just beneath the water's surface. The orca's body brushed against him, a brief, terrifying contact that made his skin crawl. The force of the contact sent him spinning, and he barely managed to right himself before another orca surfaced nearby. Thomas's pulse raced as he fought to stay calm, to keep his head above the water. The pod wasn't attacking yet, but the way they moved around him, so controlled, so precise, told him they were waiting for the right moment. What do I do? What do I do? He thought desperately. The water shifted beneath him, And then, with a terrifying speed, the first orca lunged, its mouth opening wide. Thomas didn't have time to react. The orca's jaws snapped shut with a deafening sound, the power of its strike sending a shockwave through the water. Thomas barely managed to swim away in time, but the force of the orca's movement sent waves crashing over him, threatening to pull him under. Another orca came at him from the other side, its sleek body rushing through the water like a missile. Thomas's heart pounded in his chest as he kicked desperately, his hands moving frantically to propel himself forward. He could feel the orca gaining on him, the cold breath of its movement sending a chill down his spine. He wasn't fast enough. The next strike came quicker than he expected. The orca hit him with terrifying force, its body slamming against his side. The impact was enough to knock the wind out of him, sending him tumbling beneath the surface. He kicked and swam blindly, disoriented and panicked, but the orca followed, always staying just out of reach, always toying with him. Thomas's body ached, his muscles screaming in protest as he fought against the current, his breath ragged in his chest. He could feel the water pulling him down, the weight of the ocean closing in around him. He wasn't sure how much longer he could keep going. His arms and legs were heavy, his strength waning with every passing second. Another orca surfaced beside him, its dark eye locked onto his with a cold, calculating gaze. The creature was so close now, its breath ragged and deep, and Thomas could feel the power in its body, the raw strength that came with being one of the ocean's apex predators. It was too much. He couldn't outrun them, couldn't outsmart them. He had no way of escaping. Panic surged through him as he looked around for anything, any sign of safety, but all he saw was the endless ocean stretching out in every direction. The orcas were everywhere now, circling him like a pack of wolves, each one moving with precision, each one waiting for the right moment to strike. He had no more fight left in him. His breath came in ragged gasps, his chest tight with fear. The realization hit him like a ton of bricks. He was going to die here in the water, surrounded by these creatures. There was no escape. But then, as quickly as it had started, the pod retreated. The water around him settled, the orcas disappearing into the depths without a sound. Thomas's heart hammered in his chest, his body trembling uncontrollably as he clung to whatever small bit of sanity he had left. The world around him felt impossibly still, the ocean calm once more. But Thomas knew better. He wasn't safe, not yet. Not by a long shot. The water had gone eerily still. Thomas's eyes flicked across the vast expanse of the ocean, searching desperately for any sign of the orcas. His body trembled violently, his skin pale beneath the thin layer of salt water that clung to him. His breath came in shallow, rapid gasps. Every nerve in his body screamed at him to swim, to make for the shore, but the distance was too great. He wasn't sure if he had the strength to make it anymore. But the longer he stayed floating there, alone in the cold water, the more that nagging feeling of being watched crept into his mind. They were still out there, the orcas, watching, waiting. He tried to clear his mind, trying to summon the calm that had once come easily to him when he'd been alone on the water, but now his thoughts were clouded with fear. Fear that he couldn't escape, fear that he wouldn't survive. A low, rumbling sound broke the silence, so faint that at first Thomas wasn't sure if it was real, but then it came again. A soft, rhythmic thrum that seemed to vibrate in the water. He froze. His breath caught in his throat. The orcas were coming. He looked around, his eyes scanning the surface of the water. He could feel them. The way the water shifted, the slight disturbance of the waves as they moved beneath him. He didn't dare take his eyes off the water. If he moved too much, he knew it would draw their attention. Suddenly, a massive shape broke the surface with a sharp splash, the water around it flying in all directions. Thomas gasped, his heart hammering in his chest. It was an orca, its sleek black and white body glistening in the early morning light. Its dorsal fin cut through the water like a knife, and its piercing dark eyes locked onto him with unnerving intensity. For a moment, Thomas couldn't move. He was transfixed by the creature's gaze. It was as if the orca was studying him, sizing him up, trying to determine whether or not he was worth the effort. His blood ran cold as the orca dove beneath the water again, disappearing into the depths. Thomas could still feel the weight of its presence. The ocean itself seemed to pulse with the energy of the pod moving through it. He didn't know how many orcas there were, but it didn't matter. They were all around him. He could sense them, waiting, circling. Stay calm, he told himself. Stay calm. But the calm he sought was elusive. His mind was racing. The shore was too far away. The orcas were too fast. There was no escape. His heart pounded in his ears, drowning out the sound of the water around him. He was alone, truly alone, and the realization hit him like a sucker punch. Come on, he muttered to himself, his voice cracking from the strain. Think, think. His hands shook as he tread water, trying to stay afloat. His arms were burning from the exertion, his body screaming at him to stop. The cold water was seeping into his bones, and his teeth chattered as he struggled to keep moving. Another orca breached the surface, this time so close that Thomas could see the water dripping off its sleek skin. The orca's black and white body gleamed like polished marble, its massive head cutting through the surface as it came closer. Its mouth opened, revealing the rows of sharp teeth that were capable of tearing through flesh with ease. Thomas's stomach twisted into a knot. His mind screamed at him to swim, to get away, but his body couldn't respond fast enough. He was paralyzed by the sheer size and power of the creature, the weight of the moment pressing down on him. Please, he whispered, more to himself than to the creature. Please don't. But the orca didn't listen. It lunged, its powerful body slicing through the water like a torpedo. Thomas barely had time to react before the orca's body slammed into him, sending him spiraling through the water. The force of the impact knocked the air out of his lungs. He gasped, his mouth open as he tried to breathe, but there was only water. He flailed, struggling to stay above the surface, but the current from the orca's strike sent him tumbling into the depths. Panic surged through him as he kicked desperately, his eyes wide with terror. He surfaced with a splutter, gasping for air, his chest tight from the shock of the attack. His head whipped around, trying to find any sign of the orca, but it was gone. The water had gone still again, as though the ocean itself were holding its breath. But Thomas knew better. He knew the orca was still out there, and it wasn't alone. His heart pounded in his chest as he swam with all the strength he had left. He could see the faint outline of his kayak in the distance bobbing on the surface, but he knew there was no way he could reach it. The orcas were too close. Too fast. Help! He choked out, his voice barely audible above the sound of the waves. Please! Help! His eyes darted around, but there was no sign of any boats, no rescue teams, just the endless expanse of water stretching out in every direction. His breath came in short bursts, his limbs growing weaker by the second. Suddenly, another orca breached the surface, and this time, it was directly in front of him. Thomas froze. He could feel the power of the creature's movements in the water, the way it seemed to glide effortlessly through the water as if it owned the ocean. Its dark eye locked onto him, and for a moment, Thomas felt as though the world had narrowed to just the two of them. The orca opened its mouth, revealing the massive teeth, and Thomas's pulse spiked in terror. He swam as fast as he could, but the orca was already closing the distance between them. He could hear the water churning as the orca moved beneath him, its enormous body sliding through the depths like a shadow. No, no, no. The orca came at him again, faster this time. Thomas didn't have time to think. He was no longer in control. The water surged around him as the orca's body crashed against his side, the impact sending him spiraling once. More. His head slammed against something hard. Rocks, or perhaps another orca. But the pain was nothing compared to the overwhelming fear that gripped him. He couldn't breathe. He couldn't think. All he could do was survive. Please, he gasped, his voice barely a whisper. The pod surrounded him, their massive bodies moving with chilling precision. He was no longer the hunter, he was the hunted. And they were closing in. Thomas kicked furiously, desperate to break free, but his body was slowing down. He was losing strength. The orcas moved faster than he ever could. He was going to drown. Another orca came at him, but this time Thomas was ready. He dove beneath the surface, his body screaming in protest as he swam blindly through the dark water. desperate to put distance between himself and the predators above. But the orcas followed, their presence like a constant, suffocating weight in the water. As he surfaced for air, he saw it, a rocky outcropping in the distance. It was small, but it was his only chance. He had to reach it. With the last of his energy, Thomas swam toward the rocks, ignoring the cold that gnawed at his bones, ignoring the pain in his arms and legs. He had no choice. The orcas were closing in. The water churned around him as they followed. But he reached the outcropping and climbed onto the jagged rocks, his hands raw from the effort. He turned, his heart still racing, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The orcas hovered nearby, their dark eyes locked onto him, but they didn't approach. They circled as if waiting. For a moment, everything was still. The only sound was the beating of Thomas's heart, pounding in his chest. And then, without another word, the orcas turned and disappeared beneath the water, vanishing into the depths. Thomas sat on the rocks, his body trembling uncontrollably, his mind racing. He had survived. But the terror, the knowledge that he had been so close to death, would haunt him for the rest of his life. The jagged rocks dug into Thomas's palms as he clung to the outcropping, his fingers raw and bleeding. His legs were numb from the cold and his chest burned with the effort of staying afloat. The water lapped at the base of the rock, but he couldn't bring himself to relax. Not yet. Not while he could still feel the phantom pressure of the orcas circling beneath him. His breath came in ragged, shallow gasps as he pressed his back to the cliff, trying to steady himself. He glanced out at the water, half expecting one of the massive black and white bodies to break through the surface at any moment. But the water was still. For now, at least. You're alive, he told himself. You made it to the rocks. It didn't help. The weight of the fear still pressed down on him like a physical thing, a suffocating fog that made it hard to think. He could still hear the sounds of the ocean in his mind, the thundering splash of the orcas as they breached, the sharp exhale of their breath, the sound of the water churning as they circled him, toying with him like a cat with a mouse. His heart raced as he remembered the overwhelming sense of being hunted, of being prey. It was a feeling unlike anything he had ever known, a visceral, bone-deep fear that left him trembling, powerless. And it wasn't over. He knew that. The orcas were out there watching. Stay calm, he thought, even though he could hear his own voice breaking as he whispered to himself. He pressed his hands harder into the rock, desperate to anchor himself to something, anything. But the terror didn't fade. It only seemed to grow with every second that passed. He glanced at his surroundings, at the stretch of water that separated him from the distant shore. His kayak was long gone, lost to the depths, but that wasn't his biggest problem. The shoreline was too far to reach on foot, and even if he could swim, the orcas were still out there. The pod hadn't left. They were watching. They were waiting. A low rumble beneath the water sent a chill through his spine, and Thomas's body tensed. There was no mistaking the sound of something large moving just beneath the surface. His pulse spiked. He wasn't alone. His fingers dug deeper into the rock, his nails scraping against the rough surface. He could feel the tension in his body, like a coil winding tighter and tighter. He couldn't see them, but he could sense them. They were close. He could feel their eyes on him. The orcas. His breath caught in his throat as the shadow of an orca moved just beneath the water's surface. It was impossibly large, its body sleek and black, the distinctive white patch near its dorsal fin glowing like a warning. Thomas's heart hammered in his chest. He froze, not daring to make a sound, afraid that any movement would draw its attention. It circled, its sleek body gliding through the water with ease, as though it were the master of this domain. Thomas barely dared to move, watching the water, watching for the next sign. His eyes flicked nervously toward the horizon. There was no one out there. No boats. No rescue. Nothing. The orca surfaced again, its dorsal fin breaking through the water, with terrifying ease slicing through the calm surface. It didn't breach the way they had before. This time it was deliberate. The creature wasn't merely playing or investigating, it was watching. And it wasn't alone. Thomas's breath came faster, his fingers aching from gripping the rock so tightly. He swallowed hard, trying to steady his breathing. His mind was a blur of confusion and fear. "What do I do? What do I do? Please," he whispered, not knowing if he was speaking to the orca or to himself. "Please, just go away." The orca's dark eyes locked onto his, and Thomas felt a cold shiver run down his spine. There was nothing playful in those eyes. No curiosity, no innocent wonder, just cold, calculating intelligence. The orca was studying him, calculating whether or not he was worth the effort. Thomas's heart thudded in his chest. He couldn't move. He was trapped. His body, frozen by fear, the waves shifted around him, but his mind was focused entirely on the massive predator that circled him. Waiting. Minutes passed, though they felt like hours. The orca remained just out of reach, its massive body sliding silently beneath the water. The only sign of its presence, the gentle ripples it left behind. Thomas's throat was dry, his mouth parched. He licked his lips, but it didn't help. Then, without warning, another orca surfaced, a different one this time. Its black and white markings were striking against the dark water, its body just as massive, just as intimidating. It glided smoothly next to the first, its body sleek and powerful. Thomas's eyes widened. He realized, too late, that the pod was closing in. A third orca surfaced, then a fourth. They were everywhere now, surrounding him. Each one appeared from beneath the surface, their massive bodies emerging like phantoms from the depths. He could see them now, each of them locked on him, their cold eyes following his every move. His mind reeled with panic. His body screamed at him to swim, to fight, but he couldn't move. He was paralyzed by the overwhelming fear, trapped by the pod of apex predators that surrounded him. "They're not going to stop," Thomas muttered to himself, his voice shaking. "They're not going to let me go." His throat tightened as he looked around, his eyes darting from one orca to the next. They were so close now, circling him, their powerful bodies cutting through the water with terrifying ease. His heart pounded in his ears, the sound deafening. A sharp cry broke through the silence, a loud, unmistakable sound of one of the orcas breaching the surface, its massive body soaring above the water for a moment before crashing back down. The sound of the splash was like a thunderclap in the stillness, and Thomas's heart skipped a beat. "This is it. They're going to kill me." His mind screamed at him to swim, but he couldn't move. His body was locked in place, too afraid to act. He could feel his heart racing, each beat a reminder of how close he was to the edge. He wasn't strong enough to fight back. He wasn't fast enough to escape. He was helpless. But then, in the midst of the terror, he remembered something. A small, fleeting thought. The rocks. With his last remaining strength, he kicked hard, propelling himself toward the cliff. His arms and legs were numb, the cold of the water sapping what little energy he had left, but he didn't care. The rocks were his only hope. He reached them, his hands slipping along the jagged edges as he scrambled to climb, his limbs burning with exhaustion. His fingers slipped, but he dug deeper, his nails scraping the rough surface. He barely noticed the pain as he pulled himself higher, away from the water and the creatures that surrounded him. Behind him, the orcas circled. He could hear them, their breath sharp and deep as they swam just beneath him, their eyes never leaving him. But they didn't strike. They didn't attack. Thomas barely noticed when the sky started to darken, or when the sounds of the pod faded into the distance. All that mattered was that he had made it. He had survived. For now. But as he lay on the rocks, trembling uncontrollably, a part of him knew that the fear, the feeling of being hunted, would never leave him. The terror, the helplessness, the knowledge that he had been at the mercy of creatures so much more powerful than he could ever be. It would haunt him forever. The water below him was still, but the memory of the orcas was anything but. The cold sting of the ocean water seemed to cling to Thomas as he sat on the jagged rocks, his limbs trembling violently. His heart was still pounding in his chest, and his breath came in ragged gasps, as though he had just run a marathon. His body felt numb, both from the cold and the terror that still gripped his chest. But somehow, he had made it to the rocks. He had survived. The pod of orcas had disappeared into the depths, vanishing from sight as quickly as they had appeared. The water around him had calmed, but the sense of danger had not. The weight of what had just happened pressed heavily on him. He could still hear the pounding of his heart, the distant roar of the ocean, and the phantom memory of the orca's massive body slamming into his kayak, sending him spiraling into the water. His hands shook as he wiped the salty spray from his face, his fingers raw from gripping the sharp edges of the rocks. He felt a sense of disbelief settle over him. How had he survived? How had he managed to escape? He had been sure he was done for, sure the orcas would finish what they had started. But they hadn't. Not yet. The minutes stretched into what felt like hours as he sat there, eyes scanning the water, waiting for the pod to return. He had no idea where they had gone, but he knew they were still out there. What now? The question echoed in his mind. There was no rescue in sight. No one knew where he was. His phone was back in the car. His kayak was lost, and the coastline was still miles away. I need to get out of here. The thought was simple, but the reality was far more complicated. He was stuck. Alone. And though he had managed to escape, the attack for the moment, he knew it wasn't over. The orcas could return at any time. Thomas's gaze shifted to the shoreline, a dark line far in the distance. It seemed impossibly far, and though he could make out the shapes of trees along the coast, there was no sign of life. The isolation was suffocating. If he didn't get to the shore, if he didn't get out of the water, he wasn't sure how long he could last. But even as his mind raced with the idea of escape, his body rebelled. He had nothing left. His strength had been drained by the cold, by the panic, by the hours he had spent trying to stay alive. Every muscle in his body was sore, his body still, slick with the seawater that had chilled him to the bone. "Please don't come back," he whispered to the ocean, his voice hoarse and barely audible over the crash of the waves. The words were futile, but they felt necessary. A desperate plea for mercy. But he knew deep down that it was pointless. The orcas didn't care about mercy. They were predators, and he was prey. Suddenly, a sharp sound broke through his thoughts. A low, echoing thrum. Thomas froze, his body tensing instinctively. His eyes scanned the water again. The silence that had fallen over the bay was now replaced by a subtle hum, a vibration that seemed to travel through the water. He could hear the faint splashes, the sound of something large moving just beneath the surface. The water trembled with the presence of something big. No, Thomas thought, not now. He wanted to scream, wanted to shout at the ocean to somehow force it to stop, to make the orcas go away. But the words stuck in his throat. There was no one to hear, no one who could help him. Another orca surfaced, just beyond. The rocks, its dorsal fin slicing through the water. Thomas's stomach lurched, his breath hitched in his chest. The creature's eye met his, and Thomas could see it clearly this time. Its gaze was cold and unfeeling, devoid of any emotion other than pure calculation. The orca didn't approach immediately. It lingered, circling around him, as if it were considering whether or not to strike. Its body slid through the water with terrifying ease, its enormous form breaking the surface and disappearing into the depths, only to resurface again, closer this time. There's no way I can outrun it. I can't swim. I'm too far from the shore. Thomas's mind raced, his heart pounding in his chest. He was trapped on these rocks with no way to get to safety. And the orca was getting closer. His fingers dug into the rock, his grip slipping slightly as his muscles ached with exhaustion. His whole body felt heavy, as if the weight of the ocean itself was pressing down on him. The fear was overwhelming, filling his chest with a suffocating pressure. "Please," he whispered again, louder this time, his voice cracking with desperation. "Just leave me alone." The orca didn't respond. It circled closer, its body cutting through the water like a sleek shadow. Thomas could feel the water vibrating beneath him as the orca moved beneath the surface. It was only a few yards away now, and he could feel the danger closing in around him. Suddenly, another orca breached the surface, closer this time. Thomas's eyes widened in terror. The pod was back. They had returned. And they were moving in, faster now, circling him with increasing urgency. The creatures were patient, calculating, and they were showing no signs of leaving. His breath quickened, and his hands shook as he desperately searched for an escape. There was nowhere to go, The rocks were his only refuge, but even they were no guarantee. The orcas could reach him. At any moment he was completely exposed. "God help me," he whispered, his voice trembling with fear. He could feel the cold salt water clinging to his skin, could taste the bitter tang of it in the back of his throat. But more than anything, he felt the overwhelming terror that came with being hunted. The orcas continued to circle, their massive bodies slicing through the water, moving with an unnatural grace. They seemed to be testing him, measuring him, toying with him as they waited for the right moment to strike. Time seemed to slow, each passing second dragging on longer than the last. Thomas could hear his heartbeat thundering in his ears, could feel the blood rushing through his veins. He could hear the water churning, the soft exhale of the orcas as they moved, their presence like a shadow, always hovering just beneath the surface. His mind raced with fear and desperation. What do I do? What can I do? He tried to calm himself, tried to think logically, but every instinct screamed at him to run, to fight. He had no weapons, no means of defending himself. The orcas were too fast, too strong. He was nothing more than a helpless human stranded on these rocks, exposed and vulnerable. Then, just as the panic reached its peak, a new sound broke through the air, a faint hum rising above the crashing waves. It was the unmistakable sound of a helicopter. Thomas's heart skipped a beat. He turned his head, his eyes scanning the sky. His breath caught in his throat as he saw it, a rescue helicopter descending toward him, the rotors slicing through the air with deafening force. "Help!" he shouted, his voice hoarse and weak. "Over here, please!" The helicopter drew closer, its powerful blades whipping up the air, sending the waves crashing against the rocks. But the orcas, perhaps sensing the presence of something larger, something far more dangerous, seemed to pause. They circled once more, then, without a sound, dove beneath the water and disappeared. Thomas watched in stunned silence as the helicopter hovered above him, a rescue diver descending on a rope ladder. He reached for it with trembling hands, but his body was too exhausted to move quickly. His legs were weak, his arms trembling from the cold and the terror. But he was alive. He was going to make it. The diver grabbed his arm, pulling him toward the rope, and Thomas clung to it, his body shaking uncontrollably. The helicopter rose slowly, pulling him from the water, away from the danger that had haunted him for so long. As they ascended, Thomas looked down one last time at the vast expanse of water. The orcas were gone, but the fear, the terror of being prey, would stay with him forever. As they soared higher into the sky, away from the ocean that had nearly claimed his life, Thomas closed his eyes, knowing he had survived. For now, Thomas woke to the harsh beeping of a heart monitor. His body felt heavy, as if he had been drugged, his muscles aching with every movement. The sterile scent of antiseptic filled the air, and he blinked, trying to make sense of the surroundings. The light was dim, and the room was quiet except for the rhythmic beeping. Slowly, the haze of fear and exhaustion began to lift, and he realized that he wasn't in the water anymore. He wasn't clinging to rocks. He was in a hospital bed. His hand reached up instinctively to touch his head, where a dull throb pulsed, and he winced at the pain. His memory of the events, everything that had happened out there in the water, felt distant, almost like it belonged to someone else. But the fear, the terror of the orcas, it was still with him, deep in his chest, in his gut. He could still feel it. The door to his room opened with a soft creak, and a nurse stepped in, a calm, professional expression on her face. She was young, with brown hair pulled back into a ponytail, and she had a clipboard in her hand. "Good morning, Mr. Keller. How are you feeling?" Thomas blinked, trying to gather his thoughts, but the words felt like they were trapped in his throat. He swallowed hard and tried to speak, but his voice came out raspy, barely a whisper. Where am I?" "You're in St. Mary's Hospital in Anchorage," the nurse replied gently. "You were rescued by a helicopter after being stranded on the rocks for several hours. Do you remember what happened?" Thomas nodded. Slowly, the memory of the orca pod surrounding him, circling him, nearly drowning him, flooding back. His pulse quickened as the panic began to rise in his chest again. He clenched his fists, trying to steady himself, but it only made the tremors worse. "The orcas," he whispered hoarsely. They were going to kill me. The nurse gave him a sympathetic look, walking over to the side of the bed and adjusting the IV in his arm. I know. You've been through something incredibly traumatic, but you're safe now. The Orcas didn't get you, you're alive, that's what matters. Thomas's heart skipped a beat as her words settled in. He was alive. The Orcas had let him go. It didn't make sense. His mind couldn't wrap around it. Why had they stopped? Why hadn't they killed him? Why? Thomas managed to croak, his voice thick with confusion. Why didn't they finish it? Why didn't they attack me? The nurse hesitated, clearly unsure of how to respond. I can't say for sure. Orcas are complex creatures. There's a lot we still don't understand about their behavior, but they tend to be intelligent and sometimes they're just curious. It's possible they lost interest or were disturbed by the helicopter that rescued you. Thomas let out a bitter laugh, though it sounded more like a strangled cough. Curious, they were hunting me. I know what I felt. The nurse placed a hand on his arm, a comforting gesture, but it did little to ease the storm in his chest. You're not alone in what you experienced, Mr. Keller. There have been other reports of orcas acting in ways that seem strange or unpredictable. Some have even attacked boats or kayaks, but it's rare, and none of them resulted in fatal injuries. You're one of the lucky ones. Lucky, Thomas repeated, the word tasting foreign on his tongue. I don't feel lucky. The nurse gave him a sympathetic smile. I understand. It's going to take time for you to process everything, but the important thing is, you survived. You're safe now. The door to his room opened again, and a doctor stepped in, a tall man in a white coat. He had a serious, no-nonsense air about him, but there was a kindness in his eyes. He looked at Thomas and nodded toward the nurse. I see he's awake, he said, his voice deep and steady. Yes, doctor. Mr. Keller is still processing everything. I think he's having trouble grasping what happened, the nurse replied. The doctor walked over to the bed and adjusted the sheets before looking at Thomas directly. Mr. Keller, I'm Dr. Harris. I'll be overseeing your recovery. You've been through a traumatic experience and we're going to make sure you're physically and mentally well taken care of. But first, I need to ask you a few questions. Thomas nodded, weakly, trying to push down the nausea that had risen in his stomach. He could still feel the fear, the helplessness, the overwhelming sense of being trapped in the water, but he nodded again, determined to focus on something else for a moment. Go ahead. Dr. Harris began asking him a series of questions about his physical condition, pain, dizziness, and numbness. Thomas answered them as best as he could, but his mind kept wandering back to the ocean, to the orcas, to the feeling of being hunted. He could still see their massive bodies in his mind, could hear the sounds of the water as they circled, their dark eyes locked onto him. He shuddered involuntarily. Dr. Harris seemed to notice, his gaze softening. Mr. Keller, we're going to get you some rest. You've been through a lot. The psychological toll of a near-death experience can be just as severe as the physical. We'll be scheduling a counselor for you as soon as possible. I don't need a counselor, Thomas said quickly, his voice hoarse. I'm fine. Just get me out of here. I want to go home. The doctor exchanged a glance with the nurse. I understand that you want to go home, but you've been through a traumatic ordeal. It's important that you get the care you need. You're not alone in this. Thomas shook his head, trying to push himself up in the bed, but the nurse gently pushed him back down. Please, Mr. Keller, just rest for now. We're going to take care of you. He couldn't rest. He couldn't. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the orcas. He saw their massive bodies moving through the water, their eyes fixed on him. The memory of the attack, the feeling of helplessness had dug its claws into him, and no amount of medical attention could take it away. I need to get out of here, Thomas repeated, his voice strained, desperate. The nurse nodded, her expression softening. You will, but not just yet. The doctors want to keep you here for a couple of days to monitor your condition. You've been through a lot, and it's going to take time for your body to recover. The stress you've experienced, combined with the physical exhaustion, could take a toll on you. You need to rest. He wanted to argue, but he was too tired, too broken. He leaned back against the pillow, his body protesting the movement. He could feel the warmth of the hospital blanket, the dull hum of the machines beside him. But none of it helped. None of it mattered. His mind kept racing. In the days that followed, Thomas was slowly brought back to reality, though it was a reality he didn't want. The Orca attack had left him with bruised ribs and mild hypothermia, but it wasn't the physical injuries that troubled him. It was the memories, the fear, the terror of being helpless, trapped in the water with creatures so much more powerful than he was. His nights were the worst. He would wake up in a cold sweat, his heart pounding, unable to breathe. The water, the orcas, they were always there, lurking at the edges of his consciousness. He could hear the sound of their breaths, could see the sharp white teeth closing in around him. It didn't matter that he was safe. It didn't matter that he was in a hospital bed. The fear clung to him like a shadow, following him everywhere. One evening, as he lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, the door to his room opened. A woman walked in, tall, with dark hair and a calm, professional air. She was carrying a folder, and she had a gentle, sympathetic smile on her face. "Mr. Keller?" she asked softly, her voice soothing. "I'm Dr. Simmons. I'm the counselor assigned to you. I've been informed of your recent experience, and I wanted to see how you're holding up." Thomas didn't respond at first, but he could feel his body tense. Another doctor. Another person who was going to try to make him talk. He didn't want to talk. He just wanted to forget. Forget the water. Forget the orcas. "I'm fine," he said gruffly, his voice hoarse. "I don't need any more doctors. I just need to go home." Dr. Simmons sat down in the chair beside his bed, placing the folder on the table. "I understand that you want to get back to your normal life, but what happened to you wasn't something most people go through. It's okay to not be okay. I'm here to help you process this." Thomas let out a bitter laugh, though it sounded more like a cough. "You think I'm going to talk about it? What good will that do? I don't expect you to talk if you're not ready, but I want you to know that you're not alone. What you went through was traumatic, and it's normal to feel the way you do. It's normal to feel afraid. It's also normal to try to avoid thinking about it, but avoiding it won't help you heal." Thomas clenched his fists, his jaw tight with frustration. He didn't want to hear it. He didn't want to listen to her talk about healing. He didn't know how to heal. "I'm fine," he repeated, his voice more forceful this time. Dr. Simmons didn't push him further. She simply nodded, standing up from the chair. "I'll be here whenever you're ready, Mr. Keller. Just know that there's no rush. Healing takes time." As she left the room, Thomas stared at the door, his fists still clenched. She was right. It would take time. The fear, the memories, wouldn't go away overnight. It would never go away. But for now, he would wait. He would try to heal. And maybe, just maybe, he could learn to live again. The days blurred together for Thomas. The pain in his ribs had faded to a dull ache, but it was the psychological scars that haunted him the most. The terror of the Orca attack continued to echo through his every waking moment, and he knew he couldn't go back to the life he had before. Not yet, anyway. His mind was still fractured. Pieces of that moment in the water, when the orcas had circled him, when he had felt the cold, calculating gaze of a predator, still clung to him like a shadow, lurking just beneath the surface of his thoughts. He was sitting up in his bed, staring out the hospital window, watching the snow fall gently outside. The world looked so peaceful from here, so normal. But Thomas knew better. The ocean, the vast expanse that had almost swallowed him whole, was out there, just beyond the safety of the walls around him. "Mr. Keller?" A soft voice broke through his reverie. He turned his head slowly to see a nurse standing in the doorway. She was smiling, but there was something in her eyes, something warm. "Patient, the doctor wants to see you. He said it's time for your final checkup before you're discharged." Thomas nodded slowly, not really hearing her words, but letting them settle in his mind. Discharged. He would be leaving the hospital soon. Part of him dreaded it, knowing he wasn't ready to face the outside world again. The thought of going back to his cabin, to the solitude that had once been comforting, now felt like a death sentence. He wasn't sure he could handle it. The world out there seemed so far removed from what had happened in the water. The attack, the orcas. It was hard to reconcile it all. Okay, Thomas replied hoarsely, his throat still raw from the days of silence and the emotional toll of the past week. I'll be ready. The nurse smiled again, her expression softening before she turned and left the room. Thomas looked out the window once more, watching the snow fall in soft, swirling patterns. It was beautiful in a way, but it only reminded him of how small and insignificant he had felt out on the water. How vulnerable. A few minutes later, Dr. Harris walked into the room, his white coat swishing slightly as he entered. He had a clipboard in hand, his expression professional but kind. "Mr. Keller, how are we feeling today?" "I'm fine," Thomas said. Automatically, his voice still hoarse but stronger than it had been. "I think I'm ready to leave." Dr. Harris studied him for a moment, his brow furrowed in thought. "I'm glad to hear you're feeling better, but I need to remind you that you've been through something incredibly traumatic. It's important that you take things slowly. Just because your physical injuries have healed doesn't mean the emotional ones have." Thomas didn't respond right away. He didn't want to talk about it, not yet. His mind was still swimming in a sea of confusion and fear. He didn't know if he was ready to face the world outside the hospital, let alone the idea of returning to his old routine. "I understand," Thomas finally said, his voice strained. "But I don't think I can stay here anymore. I just want to go home. I'll deal with it. Somehow." Dr. Harris sighed, the sound heavy with understanding. "I can't force you to stay here, Mr. Keller, but I urge you to take it easy. The trauma you've experienced, being attacked by such a powerful predator, it's not something that can be processed overnight. You'll need support. And if you start feeling overwhelmed, if the memories come back stronger than you expect, I need you to reach out. Don't try to handle it all alone." "I won't be alone," Thomas said, his tone sharp, though he quickly regretted it. "I'll be fine. I've been alone before." Dr. Harris studied him for a moment longer before giving a small nod. "All right, I'll arrange for your discharge paperwork. But remember, Mr. Keller, healing takes time. It's okay to ask for help." "I'll be fine," Thomas repeated, though he wasn't sure if he believed the words anymore. As Dr. Harris turned to leave, Thomas felt a sudden wave of unease. The idea of being discharged, of being set free from the sterile walls of the hospital, felt like a sentence. He wasn't sure if he was ready to face the real world again. He wasn't sure if he could handle the weight of the memories. He sat on the edge of the bed, his hands resting on his knees, staring blankly at the floor. His mind drifted back to the moments in the water when the orcas had surrounded him, their massive bodies slicing through the waves with terrifying speed. He could still hear the sound of their breaths, the way the water churned around him, the way they had seemed to stalk him as if they knew he was no match for them. His heart began to race again as the memories flooded back, and his hands began to shake. A soft knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. He turned, startled, to see a familiar face standing in the doorway. It was the nurse from earlier, but this time she wasn't holding a clipboard. Her expression was more thoughtful, almost concerned. "Mr. Keller, I wanted to let you know that your discharge papers are ready," she said gently. But there was something else in her eyes. She seemed to hesitate, as if unsure whether to continue, but after a moment she stepped inside the room. I know it's been hard for you. The staff here has talked about it. We all know that trauma like what you've experienced doesn't just go away. But I want you to know that we're here for you, even after you leave." Thomas gave her a curt nod, but inside, he felt a wave of frustration rise. He didn't want anyone's pity. He didn't want to talk about it. He just wanted to get away, to escape the memories that had taken root in his mind. "I'll be fine," he said again, the words sounding hollow even to him. "I just need some time to figure things out." The nurse's gaze softened and she stepped closer. "I understand," she said. "But if you ever need anything, don't hesitate to reach out. There's no shame in asking for help. You don't have to go through this alone." Thomas looked down at his hands, his fingers clenched into fists. He didn't want to talk to anyone. He didn't want anyone to see him weak, to see him like this. The fear still clung to him like a second skin, and every time he closed his eyes, he was back in the water, surrounded by those dark, predatory shapes. "I'll be fine," he repeated, more to himself than to her. He stood abruptly, the movement jerky, as though he were forcing himself to get up and move. I need to go." The nurse didn't argue, though she clearly wanted to. Instead, she nodded and quietly left the room, allowing him the space he needed. Minutes later, a nurse came in with his discharge paperwork, and before Thomas knew it, he was being wheeled out of the hospital, free to leave. The cold air hit him as they rolled him toward the front doors, and he breathed in deeply, letting the fresh air fill his lungs. But there was no relief. His body was still on high alert, still tense, as though he couldn't let go of the fear, as though the orcas were still out there, waiting for him to slip back into the water. As the doors opened, Thomas felt a strange heaviness settle over him. The outside world felt both too big and too small at once. He had survived, yes. But what came after survival? He looked around, taking in the quiet streets of Anchorage, the snow-covered landscape stretching out before him. It was so calm, so normal. The world had gone on without him, without any acknowledgement of the fear that had nearly destroyed him. And yet he felt completely detached from it all. He was escorted to the parking lot where his truck sat, waiting for him. The drive back to his cabin felt like a dream, his hands gripping the wheel tighter than necessary, his eyes darting around at every shadow, every movement. The forest loomed on the horizon as he drove further into the wilderness. The trees seemed to close in around him, their branches reaching out like skeletal fingers. The road to his cabin was long and lonely, winding through the thick forest. Thomas had always loved the isolation, the quiet, but now it felt oppressive. He could almost hear the waves crashing against the rocks, see the orcas rising from the depths of his mind. When he finally arrived, he pulled into the driveway and sat in the truck for a moment, staring at the cabin. It was small, simple, and isolated, just the way he liked it. But now it felt like a prison. The memories of the attack would never leave him, not while he was here, surrounded by nothing but the wilderness that had nearly claimed him. With a deep breath, Thomas stepped out of the truck, his legs unsteady as he walked toward the door. He opened it and stepped inside, but the familiar smell of pine and wood didn't comfort him. The place was empty, just as it had always been, but it no longer felt like home. It felt like a place he had to escape from. The door closed behind him with a soft thud. The shadows in the corners of the room seemed to deepen, and for the first time, Thomas wondered if he could ever truly be free again. Thomas stood in the middle of his cabin, the silence pressing down on him like a heavy weight. The walls, once familiar and comforting, now felt like a cage. The flickering light of the single lamp in the corner cast long, distorted shadows across the room, making the space feel cold and empty. He had always preferred being alone, the isolation of the wilderness offering a sense of peace. But now the stillness felt suffocating, as if the very air had thickened with the weight of his memories. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. He turned abruptly, his eyes scanning the room, expecting to see a shape lurking in the corner, the dark eyes of the orcas watching him. But there was nothing. The room was empty, just as it had always been. "Get it together," he muttered to himself, his voice rough from the days of silence. He had been home for a few hours now after leaving the hospital. The journey had been long and exhausting, but the true weight of his ordeal hadn't hit him until he stepped inside the cabin. Now, it felt like he had crossed an invisible threshold, one that separated his past life from the one that had been irrevocably changed. His thoughts drifted back to the hospital, to the gentle but firm advice of the doctors and nurses. They had all told him the same thing. Healing would take time, but none of them knew what it felt like, what it was like to be out there in the water, surrounded by those creatures, those predators. They couldn't understand the fear that still gripped him, the constant gnawing sensation that he wasn't truly safe, that at any moment something would surface from the depths, waiting to finish what had been started. He paced around the cabin, unable to settle. The cabin was small, a modest wooden structure tucked away in the forest. It was everything he had ever wanted in a home. Quiet, simple, isolated. But now, it felt like a prison. Every creak of the floorboards, every gust of wind outside, made his skin crawl. He couldn't escape the memories of the ocean, the fear that had consumed him. Thomas's breath quickened as he reached the small kitchen area. He grabbed a glass from the counter and filled it with water, his hand shaking as he held it to his lips. He drank deeply, the cold water a brief distraction from the racing thoughts in his mind. The orcas had never left him. They were always there, lurking in the corners of his mind, waiting for him to slip back into the ocean. Even now, as he sat in his cabin, the memories played out in vivid detail. The dark eyes of the orca staring at him, the waves crashing against his kayak, the feeling of being helpless and small. A knock on the door startled him, and he nearly dropped the glass. He set it down quickly, his heart pounding as he moved toward the door. Who could be here? No one ever came out this far. He opened the door cautiously, half expecting to find one of the locals, maybe someone from the hospital checking in on him. But it wasn't a familiar face that greeted him. A man stood on the porch, tall and broad-shouldered, wearing a thick jacket and boots caked with snow. His face was weathered, his eyes dark and tired. He had the look of someone who had spent too many years in the wilderness, someone who had seen things most people would never understand. "Thomas Keller?" the man asked, his voice low and gravelly. Thomas's heart skipped a beat. "Who are you?" The man stepped closer, his expression unreadable. "My name's Jack. I'm a local fisherman. I've been hearing a lot about you. Word travels fast around here." Thomas's mind raced. He didn't know anyone named Jack, and the last thing he wanted was someone from the outside world coming to check on him. He had wanted peace, not pity. "I don't know you," Thomas said, trying to keep his voice steady. "What do you want?" Jack seemed to study him for a moment, his gaze flicking over Thomas with a look of something akin to understanding. "I've heard what happened out there," he said quietly. "The Orca attack." Thomas's blood ran cold. He tried to shut the door, but Jack was faster. He stepped forward, blocking the entrance with ease. "I know what you're going through," Jack continued, his voice softer now, but still filled with a deep resonance that hinted at a personal connection. "I've seen it before, seen what it does to people." "I don't need your help," Thomas said sharply, his hand gripping the door handle tighter. "I'm fine. I don't need anyone to tell me what I'm feeling." Jack didn't budge. He just stood there, his eyes steady, unwavering. "You might not need help, but I can tell you need someone to talk to. I've been out there in the water, too. I know what it's like. Those orcas don't just go away. They stay with you. And if you don't deal with it, they'll consume you." The words hit Thomas like a punch to the gut. He could feel the tension in his chest tighten, the fear rising again. He didn't want to admit it. But Jack was right. He was being consumed by it. The orcas had already taken over his mind, twisting everything he saw, heard, and felt. It wasn't just the memory of the attack, it was the weight of it, the terror, the helplessness. It was living with the knowledge that something so powerful had taken him to the edge of death, and it could do it again at any moment. "I'm fine," Thomas repeated, though this time it sounded less convincing. "I don't need anyone's pity." Jack's gaze softened and he took a step back, giving Thomas some space. "I'm not offering pity, I'm offering a chance to talk. To not feel so damn alone in this. Because I know what that feels like. I know the terror, the fear that keeps you up at night. I know how it eats you alive. And I know that if you don't face it, it'll destroy you." For a moment, Thomas stood frozen, the weight of Jack's words settling over him. He didn't want to admit it. He didn't want to face the truth. But he was drowning in his own fear, trapped in his cabin, unable to escape the memories of the ocean. "Why should I listen to you?" Thomas finally asked, his voice a mixture of suspicion and something else, something darker. "You don't know me, you don't know what I went through." Jack met his gaze without flinching. "You're right, I don't know you, but I know what it's like to face something you can't control, to be left with nothing but fear. I've seen it. In the eyes of men who come back from the wilderness, men who've seen things that haunt them. I've been there myself." There was a long pause, and Thomas's mind raced. His chest felt tight, his hands clammy with sweat. He wanted to slam the door shut, to retreat back into the dark comfort of his isolation. But part of him knew that he couldn't keep running from this. Not forever. Jack's voice broke through the silence again, soft but insistent. "You don't have to do this alone. You don't have to carry this by yourself." Thomas looked at him, The walls he had built around himself starting to crumble. He was tired. So tired. Tired of pretending that everything was fine. Tired of locking himself away from the world. Maybe, just maybe, Jack was right. Maybe it was time to stop running. Come inside, Thomas said quietly, stepping back from the door. Let's talk. Jack nodded and stepped inside, his heavy boots leaving tracks on the floor. Thomas shut the door behind him, the quiet of the cabin settling in again. But this time, it didn't feel so oppressive. For the first time in days, Thomas allowed himself to feel something other than fear. He wasn't sure where the conversation would lead, but it didn't matter. For the first time, he wasn't alone in this fight. And maybe, just maybe, that was the first step toward healing. The fire crackled in the small stone hearth, its warm glow illuminating the cabin in a soft amber light. The smell of burning pine filled the room, mixing with the cold, crisp air that still lingered from the outside. Thomas sat across from Jack, a bottle of whiskey between them, both men quiet for a long time, staring into the flames. The conversation had been difficult to start. After Jack had entered the cabin, they had both sat in silence for several minutes. Thomas had avoided looking at him, unsure of how to start. The walls had been up for so long, the isolation so ingrained in his life, that it felt almost impossible to lower them. But Jack had been patient. He hadn't pressured him. He'd simply waited. And now, as the night wore on, something inside Thomas shifted. He knew it wasn't healthy to keep everything bottled up. Maybe it was time to talk. Jack reached for the whiskey, pouring a generous amount into both their glasses before settling back into his chair. The deep lines on his face spoke of years, spent in the wilderness dealing with hardships and burdens that were hard to even comprehend. Thomas noticed how Jack didn't immediately drink, but instead swirled the liquor in his glass, the sound of the liquid mixing with the low hum of the fire. Tell me about it, Jack said quietly, his voice calm but filled with understanding. I know you're not fine, Thomas. You can't keep pretending. Thomas felt his throat tighten. The words stuck there, lodged like a stone. He took a deep breath, his fingers tightening around the glass in his hand. He could feel the burn of the whiskey even before he drank it. I was out there, Thomas began, his voice rough, a faint tremble in it. And I thought it was just another day, you know? Just another trip out on the water. But then everything changed. It went from calm to chaos so fast. I didn't even have time to react. I was nothing. Just pray. He swallowed, trying to steady his voice. The words felt foreign, almost like they didn't belong to him, as if someone else had experienced them. But the fear, the raw terror, was all his. Jack didn't interrupt, just nodded slowly, his gaze steady. He took a slow drink from his own glass, the firelight flickering in his eyes as he listened. Thomas could feel the weight of his words, heavy with the truth of his experience. The floodgates were opening, and there was no stopping it now. They were circling me, Thomas continued, his voice now thick with emotion. Like sharks. Only they were orcas, and they were smart. They knew what they were doing. They knew I was helpless, and I couldn't get away. Every time I tried, they just stayed with me, watching me. I could feel their eyes on me. I could feel the water, their movements beneath the surface, like I was nothing but prey to them. He took a deep breath, his hands trembling as he set the glass down on the table, his gaze still fixed on the fire. The memory of it, the helplessness, was overwhelming. It felt like he was back there again, in the water, surrounded by those massive creatures, their eyes dark and cold. He could still hear the sound of their breathing, the rhythmic rise and fall of the water around him. Jack set his glass down, leaning forward slightly, his elbows resting on his knees. You're still feeling it, aren't you? He asked, quietly, his voice softer now but filled with empathy. Thomas nodded, his throat tight. I don't know how to explain it. I feel like I'm still out there, like they're still watching me. It's not just the memory. It's the fear that comes with it. It's not going away. I can't shake it. For a moment Jack was silent, considering his words carefully. "You're never going to forget what happened," he said, his tone firm but gentle. "It's going to stay with you. But you have to understand something. What you felt out there, the fear, that was real. And it's okay to feel that way. But it doesn't have to control you. You're alive, Thomas. That means something." Thomas looked up at him, the words hanging in the air between them. Alive. He hadn't felt alive in a long time. He had been merely existing, moving through the days without truly living. He had been so focused on surviving that he hadn't stopped to consider what that meant. "I don't know how to stop it," Thomas said quietly, his voice cracking, slightly. "It's like a ghost, always there. Every time I close my eyes, I'm back in that water, fighting for my life. I can't get away from it. It won't leave me alone." Jack leaned back in his chair, his eyes thoughtful. "You don't just let go of something like that overnight. It's not a switch you can flip, but you can start by acknowledging that it happened, that you were there, that you survived, and that's something you can take with you. The Orcas, what they did, they don't define you. They were just part of your story, part of this chapter in your life, but they don't own you. You still have the power to move forward." Thomas looked down at his hands, the words swirling around in his head, but it was hard to believe. How could he move forward when everything felt like it had been shattered? The fear was too real, too constant. He didn't know how to leave it behind. "Do you still think about it?" Thomas asked, his voice almost a whisper. "When you're out there fishing, do you still think about what happened to you?" Jack's expression shifted slightly, his gaze growing distant for a moment, as if the question had taken him back to a place he didn't want to revisit. "I do," he said quietly, "but I don't let it control me. The water's a dangerous place, sure, but it's also beautiful. And I've learned that no matter how much you try to avoid the fear, it's always there. The key is to accept it, to respect it, and then keep going anyway." Thomas felt a weight in his chest, the depth of what Jack was saying. He wasn't sure if he could ever fully accept what had happened, but perhaps there was some truth to it. Maybe he could stop running from the fear. Maybe he could start living with it instead of letting it rule him. For the first time in days, Thomas felt a flicker of something else. Hope? Maybe. It wasn't much, but it was enough to let him see a path forward, however uncertain. The fire crackled again, the sound filling the silence as the two men sat, across from each other, neither one rushing to speak. The weight of the conversation, the honesty of it, hung in the air, and for the first time since the attack, Thomas felt like he was no longer carrying the burden alone. After a long pause, Jack spoke again, his voice low but steady. "You're gonna have to face this, Thomas. It won't be easy, and it won't happen all at once. But you can get there. Just take it one step at a time." Thomas nodded slowly, the words sinking in. Maybe that was the way forward. Maybe it wasn't about forgetting the attack or erasing the fear. Maybe it was about learning to live with it, to not let it define him. It wasn't the answer he had hoped for, but it was the only one that made sense. "Thank you," Thomas said, his voice quieter now. "I don't know if I'm ready yet, but I'll try. I'll try to move forward." Jack's expression softened. That's all any of us can do. For the first time in what felt like forever, Thomas didn't feel completely alone. The weight of the past was still there, but it no longer felt like it would crush him. The road ahead might be long, but for the first time in days, he had some idea of where to begin. He took a slow drink from his glass, the warmth of the whiskey spreading through him, and finally, for the first time since the attack, he let himself relax just a little. The fire crackled in the background, the night outside calm and silent, and for the first time in a long time, Thomas felt the possibility of peace. The morning light broke through the small windows of the cabin, casting soft beams across the worn wooden floor. The fire had burned down to embers, and the quiet of the wilderness pressed against the walls. The only sound, the occasional creak of the logs in the house. Thomas woke up with a start, his heart hammering in his chest. It was a moment of disorientation, as if he were coming back from somewhere distant. For a few seconds he didn't remember where he was or why. But then it all came rushing back. The Orcas, the fear, the isolation. He sat up in bed, wiping his hand across his face, The familiar weight of exhaustion hung heavily on him, both physical and emotional. He hadn't slept much in the last few days. Every time his eyes closed, the memories of the water, the orcas, came rushing back. But the night before, Jack had been there. They had talked, really talked. And for the first time in days, the crushing sense of being utterly alone in the world began to lift just a little. "Okay," Thomas whispered to himself, forcing himself to take a deep breath. One step at a time. He swung his legs over the edge of the bed, the chill of the floorboards seeping through his socks. The simple act of getting out of bed felt like a victory. For the first time, he didn't feel entirely trapped by his own thoughts. He had a long road ahead of him. But maybe, just maybe, there was a way out of this. The sound of a knock at the door startled him. His body tensed, automatically, and for a brief moment he felt that all too familiar knot of anxiety tightening in his chest. The fear was still there, lurking, waiting for him to falter. He shook it off, breathing deeply and forcing himself to stay calm. Whoever it wasn't an orca. He stood up, walking toward the door, trying to focus on the steady rhythm of his breath. When he opened the door, Jack stood on the other side, dressed in his usual outdoor gear, heavy boots, thick jacket, and gloves. "You up yet?" Jack asked with a half-smile, his eyes still carrying the weight of someone who had spent years in the wilderness, but there was a warmth there now, too. "Yeah," Thomas replied, his voice rough. "I'm up." Jack stepped inside without waiting for an invitation, his presence as solid as the mountains that surrounded the cabin. He set down his gear by the door and gave Thomas a quick once-over. "I was going to head out for a little fishing this morning. Thought you might want to join me." Thomas hesitated. The idea of leaving the cabin, of stepping back into the world outside, made his stomach churn. He had gotten so used to being alone, to avoiding people in the vast, unforgiving wilderness. But Jack was right. He had to face it. He couldn't hide forever. Fishing. It wasn't about the fish. It wasn't even about the wilderness. It was about facing the fear, taking a small step forward. He'd spent so much time running from everything that had happened, so much time retreating into himself. Maybe this was what he needed. Something simple. Something to ground him. "I don't know," Thomas said, his voice uncertain. What if I can't handle it?" Jack gave him a knowing look. "You won't know until you try. The water's calm today. You've got nothing to prove to anyone, Thomas. Just come with me, sit. Get used to the feeling of the world around you instead of hiding from it." Thomas nodded slowly, the fear still there, gnawing at him. But he knew Jack was right. He couldn't keep running. The idea of sitting there, in the silence, just fishing, felt daunting, but it also felt like the first step toward something resembling normalcy. "All right," Thomas said finally. "Let's go." Jack gave him a smile, nodding in approval. He grabbed his gear, slinging a fishing rod over his shoulder as he made his way toward the door. "I'll be outside waiting." Thomas took a moment before following, standing at the door for a beat longer than he had meant to. The cold air greeted him as soon as he stepped outside. He pulled on his jacket, the crispness of the morning biting at his skin. The snow had settled on the ground overnight, creating a pristine layer of white that stretched as far as the eye could see. The forest stood tall around him, its trees dusted with snow, the quiet broken only by the occasional gust of wind. He walked over to where Jack stood, next to a small wooden boat that was tethered to the dock by the lake. The water was calm like a sheet of glass, reflecting the blue sky and the surrounding trees. "This is where it all starts," Jack said, handing him a rod. "You don't need to do anything but sit and wait. Let the world move around you. The fish are just an excuse." Thomas took the rod, his fingers wrapping around the handle. It was heavier than he remembered, the weight of it unfamiliar in his hand. He looked at Jack, who was already pushing the boat into the water. "You really think it's that simple?" Jack chuckled, the sound deep and genuine. "It's not simple, no, but it's a start. You can't fight the things that scare you by ignoring them. You've got to face them head on. The fish, the water, they're part of the world just like you are. You can't control the fish and you can't control the water, but you can decide how you're going to react to them." Thomas thought about that as he climbed into the boat, sitting at the front while Jack took the back. The boat creaked under their combined weight, and the slow, steady rock of the water seemed to calm him in ways he hadn't expected. For a long time they sat there in silence, the only sound the faint lapping of the water against the boat and the occasional, soft clink of the fishing rods. Jack didn't rush him, didn't try to make him talk. He just sat there casting his line into the water, his expression focused but peaceful. Thomas watched the way Jack handled the rod, his movements fluid and practiced, but it wasn't the fishing that held his attention. It was the stillness of the moment, the silence broken only by nature, the trees swaying in the distance, the light breeze ruffling the surface of the water. It felt like the world was breathing again, like it wasn't just the orcas that could make him feel small. It was the entire vastness of the world, and he had to learn how to be a part of it, not a prisoner to it. After a while, Jack broke the silence. "How are you feeling?" Thomas glanced over at him, surprised that Jack hadn't forced a conversation earlier. He was waiting for him to be ready, and now Thomas was. The words came slowly, but they were real. I'm scared," Thomas admitted, his voice low. "I'm scared that I'll never get over this, that I'll always feel this small, this helpless. I don't know how to stop thinking about it, the orcas, the way they watched me." Jack nodded, his eyes steady. "You're not going to stop thinking about it, not all at once. But that doesn't mean you can't keep going. You don't have to push the fear away. You don't have to forget what happened, but you can choose not to let it control you. It'll always be a part of you. But it doesn't have to define you." Thomas let that sink in, the weight of the words settling over him like a blanket. Maybe it wasn't about erasing the fear. Maybe it was about learning to live with it, about acknowledging it without letting it consume him. He let out a slow breath, feeling the tension ease in his shoulders for the first time in days. I think I'm starting to understand." Jack smiled, his eyes crinkling at the corners. "Good. That's all anyone can ask for. Take it one step at a time. The fear will always be there, but it doesn't have to take over your life." Thomas looked out at the water, watching as the boat glided through the glass-like surface. The fear was still there, lurking in the back of his mind, but it wasn't the only thing there anymore. Slowly, carefully, he was learning how to live with it. And for the first time in days, maybe even weeks, Thomas allowed himself a small, tentative hope.